Africa Continental Free Trade Area, as well as the epicenter of Africa's move to position itself as the next frontier of global investment and industrial transformation. That is why, honorable members, we have grown tremendously from 3 founding partner states to 8 countries, connecting the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, serving 350 million citizens and forging a major market. These achievements are chiefly due to the contribution, to a great extent, by the East African Legislative Assembly. The work that this assembly does matters to us as governments and matters to the people of East Africa. We must therefore remain focused on what is at stake, committed to complete the outstanding work, and determined to do our very best at all times when called upon to serve the people of our region. Peace, stability, and security must remain our foremost concern because they are the foundations that underlie all pursuit of growth, development, and prosperity. A peaceful, stable, and secure East Africa is a competitive and prosperous East Africa. As we work and as we continue to work on such challenges to the growth of trade and investment as persistent on non-tariff barriers, distracting and costly trade disputes, conflicting tax regimes, weak enforcement, and inadequate resources, we must also take seriously the fundamental shortcomings to our agenda that is low involvement of the private sector, even as we prepare to get and stay on top of emerging threats in the digital space as well as climate change. Now that we have adequately established that this assembly possesses what it takes to drive our vision of a prosperous, competitive, secure, stable, and politically united East Africa, I take this opportunity, honorable members, to pose a few issues to the honorable members gathered here. It is important for us to lay a strong foundation for East Africa to make a transformative contribution to Pan-African integration and the emergence of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area as the next hub of global investment, trade, and industry. In order to do this, we have to complete the implementation of all the pillars of EAC integration urgently and equally critically align our integration agenda with a broader African transformational paradigm under the Africa we want. Secondly, we must provide a strong framework for achieving rapid leapfrogging and the development of sustainable competitive advantage in emerging high-tech fields, such as the digital economy in general, and artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, and machine learning in order to stay ahead of both threats and opportunities that will continue to unfold in a rapidly digitizing global economy. Thirdly, there is need to lend your support to the African Leaders Nairobi Declaration and Call to Action, which defines a strong and distinctly African contribution to the global discourse on humanity's foremost existential challenge by affirming the nexus between climate action and sustainable development and calling for increased investment in Africa to kickstart a green industrial revolution. Let me explain, because it is important. When we met in Nairobi last year, we made a deliberate decision that we were no longer going to be in the corner where we are seen as victims. of climate change, and where our big preoccupation is on complaining, finger-pointing, and doing what we've done for many years, that we are going to reposition our continent as a place of opportunity, great potential, and ready for investment. Because indeed, it is no longer tenable for us to continue wearing the badge of conflict and disease and poverty, when in our borders we have the largest deposits of mineral. In fact, 30% of world natural minerals and natural resources are in our continent. We have 60% of all renewable energy resources globally. We have 1.4 billion people market. In fact, by 2025, it is going to be the single largest market in the world. We have 2/3 of the world's uncultivated, arable land that we can use for food security. Ladies and gentlemen, with those kind of resources, it is incorrect to classify our continent as a continent of conflict, poverty, and disease. In fact, as one Nigerian great philosopher said, that until the lion learned how to write their story, all stories glorified the hunter. So it is time for us to write our own story. And our own story is not about disease, it's not about conflict, it's not about poverty. It is about great potential that we have. It is about the opportunities that we have. It is about the investment that is awaiting, and position our continent as the only place where the next industrial revolution is going to happen. And therefore, it is important for you as legislators from EAC to appropriate this position so that together we can push a new narrative for our continent. To ameliorate the resource constraints which persistently hamper our progress, this Assembly is called upon to reflect deeply on the range of opportunities and the various ways in which it can complement national and regional efforts to mobilize and allocate more resources for the regional integration agenda. And as you do that, you must have in sharp focus what we are doing in EAC and how we can complement what we are doing as a continent. In particular, I challenge you to apply your deliberative bandwidth to the forthcoming World Bank Group's International Development Association, IDA Summit. And let me explain what we are going to do in this summit. When we had this conversation last year, and our development partners realized that we were changing the narrative about our continent, and that we no longer wanted to be victims, we wanted to be part of the solution. They asked me to host the first IDA replenishment, what we are calling IDA 21 replenishment here in Nairobi, together with the World Bank. So we are going to host it on the 29th of April 2024. And what is the conversation? The conversation here is East Africa will, for the first time, have the opportunity to witness from a close quarter and contribute to the important deliberations of critical implementation of our growth agenda and development. At this event, African leaders, including many from the global south and low-income countries, will articulate a strong case for an ambitious and robust 21st replenishment of AIDA, which is the largest source of development assistance and donor funding for basic social services for the world's 75 low-income countries, and to support economic transformation, especially in Africa and throughout the global south. So, let me contextualize this. You know, we have two fundamental problems, and that is why many of our countries are struggling with the debt. Two fundamental problems. Problem number one is debt management. The kind of debt infrastructure that we have has very short grace period, has very short tenure, and therefore it becomes very difficult to undertake any meaningful development. Our position is that we should increase the grace period for money borrowed for development, not 3 years, maybe 10 years. We should increase the tenure of debt for development resources, not 15 years, but maybe between 40 and 50 years. That way, when you mobilize resources for development, you have adequate time to be able to undertake that development without the constraints of having to repay this debt. That is number one. Number two, the other problem that we have in the whole of financing development is what we are calling responsible sovereign lending. What do we mean by that? We're saying it is no longer tenable for us to have this big animal called credit rating, where countries using arbitrary formula are rated here, and if you don't do certain things, you are taken down, and as you are taken down, you pay more interest. It is also, we need to have a conversation about credit rating agencies, and we need to have a conversation about risk assessment. Because there is perceived risk that becomes larger than real risk. And that perceived risk is pushed by certain quotas to make Africa uncompetitive. And that is the reason why, while others are accessing development resources at 1 or 2%, most African countries are accessing development resources in markets at between 10 and 15%. Explain to me, honorable members, if one set of countries are accessing development resources at 1-2%, and another is accessing between 10 and 15%, is it realistically possible for us to grow at the same rate? No. This is the conversation we must have. You know? And we must remove this arbitrary unfairness. You know, this arbitrary unfairness from global financing. And that is why we are saying we must have a thorough conversation about the reform of multilateral development banks and the whole international financial architecture as a whole. When we started this debate a year ago, we looked like mad people. But I promise you, today, in every meeting, everybody has come to the conclusion that there is a problem with the architecture of international financing. And the conversation is no longer if, the conversation is when are we and how are we going to reform it. And that is why it is important for institutions like the East Africa Legislative Assembly to apply your mind to what kind of contribution are you going to make in this reform that is going to make our economies access development financing. It is the only way we can make meaning to our development. The last IDA replenishment, for example, in 2021 raised US dollars 91 billion, which was disbursed to eligible beneficiary countries over a period of 3 years. The Kenya Summit that we are holding in April aims to highlight to donors and other development partners critical priority target areas of development financing in Africa and in our region, make the case for a significantly higher level of financing in IDA 21 cycle, and support East African countries to effectively address development challenges and exploit the huge opportunities that we have in our region. This is the candid conversation we're going to have. And I am very confident that the fact that World Bank accepted that this was a necessary exercise confirms to us that somebody somewhere is listening to what we are saying. You know? And our position is, it is not going to be done until it is done. Yes. I have invited my fellow heads of state and government to participate in this highly important platform. Being confident of this Assembly's capacity to facilitate transformative interventions, I urge you, honorable members, to join this course and formulate your contributions to this endeavor with urgency. Give some imagination, put in it some ambition, so that together we can push an agenda that is going to support all our economies. I am highly obliged to you, Honorable Speaker, for inviting me to address this Assembly. I do not take your consideration for granted, and I believe we're going to have a discourse that is going to be beneficial for all our countries. I wish you all, honorable members, productive engagements, insightful debates, and fruitful deliberations as you usher in the third session of this Assembly. Feel at home while you are in Kenya. It's called magical Kenya, the home of all humankind.